Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar and taking the time to learn about the important topic of transparency in land investment contracts. My name is Yulia Panfil, and I am part of the Property Rights Investments team at the Omidyar Network. I will be your moderator for this panel. As we know, over the last decade, land-based investments in developing countries have been on the rise. According to the Land Matrix, a global online database of land deals, since the year 2000, almost 50 million hectares of land have been acquired or marked for acquisition by mining, agriculture, forestry, tourism, and other projects. Many of these project sites are in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. These land deals hold tremendous promise for local communities. They can stimulate local economies and they can bring jobs. But at the same time, many of these deals take place in areas where land governance is weak and rights are undocumented. Contracts are often negotiated behind closed doors, out of the reach of the people that they will affect most. This creates the potential for serious injustice and risks communities, investors, and the environment. Transparency is a critical component of leveling the playing field and making sure that everybody benefits from these investments. That means knowing where the project is sited, who is involved, what resources are being used, on what timeline, and at whose expense. This webinar will profile two tools that seek to bring greater transparency to land-based investments, openlandcontracts.org and Global Forest Watch. We will open with a few words of welcome from Fritz Jung, Deputy Head of the Rural Development Division, Land Rights and Forestry Organization for the German Federal Ministry of the Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Next, we'll hear from Sam Zoki-Burke, a legal researcher with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, who works in the areas of land, agriculture, and extractive industries. Sam will tell us about openlandcontracts.org, an online repository and publicly available contracts for large-scale land, agriculture, and forestry projects. Next, we'll hear from Jessica Webb, Civil Society Engagement Manager with the World Resources Institute. Jessica will tell us about Global Forest Watch, an online forest monitoring and alert system that produces information to better manage and conserve forests. Jessica will also tell us about a recent WRI study on the transparency of logging, mining, and agricultural data in 14 forested countries. Then we'll hear from Elise Tual, Deputy Director of the Instituto Centro de Vida in Brazil. Elise will present on access to mining and logging concessions information, and also on the enabling conditions and challenges to transparency in Brazil. And then finally, we will take questions from the audience. We have a diverse group of over 100 participants from all over the world tuning in, so hopefully we'll have an engaging discussion. You don't have to wait until the presenters are done speaking to start asking your questions. Please just feel free to type them into the chat box on the right of your screen as the questions come to you. Then we'll select as many questions as we have time for and answer them. And with that, I would like to pass the microphone over to Fritz Jung.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, Fritz. Fritz, can you hear us?
We do. Double speech.
So do you want to press unmute? Unmute.
Hello.
Hi, Fritz.
Hi, Fritz.
We can hear you. if everybody other than Fritz can please mute themselves. We hear some crackling in the background. And Fritz, if you can hear us and can unmute yourself. If not, we'll perhaps move on to Sam and then have a few words of welcome from Fritz in a bit. Okay. Let's move on to Sam. Sam, if you'd like to share your screen with the audience.
Sure thing. Okay. Is that coming up okay now?
Yes. See you.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks very much, Julia, for those words of introduction, and thanks to the Openness in Natural Resources Working Group and the World Bank, and to Susie in particular for making this webinar possible. I'm very excited to be a part of it. So I am here today to talk about openlandcontracts.org, which is a global repository of large-scale land, agriculture, and forestry contracts. Just to give you a very brief outline of what I want to cover in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll start by giving some overall context about investment contracts in general and how they relate to land projects. I'll then talk about open land contracts in particular and how it contributes to transparency. After that, I'll look at some of the challenges that we face, that open land contracts faces in achieving its goals, and then conclude by looking at some of the practical uses of open land contracts, especially focusing on civil society and local community actors. So first, to look at the context and why we are focusing on investment contracts. If we look at investments in agriculture and forestry, these projects are governed by a range of different legal frameworks. We have the national laws of the host state, which include the Constitution, laws on environment, taxation, and so on, as well as the laws of the home state, which might include anti-bribery laws or stock exchange listing laws that apply to companies investing overseas. And by home state, I mean the state in which the company is domiciled. We also have international law, so international human rights law, environmental law, and international investment law all create obligations on governments that can impact on how they host land-based investments. And then we have international standards and best practices, including finance-related standards. For instance, if the IFC is providing finance to a company that wants to carry out a forestry or agricultural project, then the IFC's performance standards will be another layer of regulation. Similarly, we have certification standards like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, if it's a palm oil project and the company is involved in that certification scheme. And then finally, and most relevantly for today, we have a range of different sorts of contracts that regulate land investments. These contracts can be between the investor, the host government, but also between financiers, service providers, and communities themselves. So the key contract type that open land contracts focuses on is the investment contract between the host government and the investor who will carry out the actual project. These contracts are important for many reasons. First of all, they can create additional obligations for the investor and even for the host government. So obligations around work requirements, social obligations, environmental protection, and so on. Investment contracts can also limit how domestic law applies. So this can include potential limitations on tax requirements or environmental and human rights protections. Investment contracts are also usually negotiated without much or any public participation or awareness at all, and they're rarely published. So we can see that this is extremely problematic given the severe human rights and environmental impacts on local communities caused by land-based investments. And contracts can also undermine the ability of host government regulators to actually monitor the contracts. Often different government departments don't even have copies of the contracts that they are officially charged with monitoring. So this is why open land contracts exist. It's to make this information more public and to try and raise awareness. So this is the home screen of open land contracts, where you can start your search to find particular contracts from particular countries. Open land contracts features the full text of contracts in both PDF and searchable text form. We also have plain language summaries, which we call them annotations of each contract's key social, environmental, fiscal, and operational provisions. And the point of the annotations is to make it so that people who don't have a legal background can still have a degree of understanding of what each contract says. And then thirdly, we tag each contract with metadata, which is the basic information about the contract. So what country is it from? When was it signed? What commodity or resource does it concern? And so on. And this is helpful to categorize the contracts, but also to improve the ability of users to search and find for the specific contract that they want. This screen shows the search page of open land contracts, and you can see that we have drop-down boxes for 8 different metadata categories, in addition to just being able to search by text. So here you can see you can search by the country, the resource, and so on. And on the second row there, the contract type, I've opened up the contract type, so you can see the drop-down of some of the different contract types that you can search for. So here we've highlighted memorandums of understanding as one particular contract type that we might like to search for. This next slide shows an example of what the contract view page looks like. So we have the kind of PDF version of the Liberia Firestone concession agreement in the middle of the screen. And then on the left-hand side, we have our plain language annotations. So here we have an annotation for the local employment provisions that the contract touches on. And you can see that the actual text itself of the contract is much more detailed and harder to understand than the kind of more concise, more simply worded annotation on the left-hand side. That's very much intentional. Okay, so what are the objectives of open land contracts? Firstly, we hope the site will promote greater transparency and facilitate disclosure of contracts. Open land contracts assembles all publicly available contracts in this searchable database, but we also hope to facilitate disclosure of land contracts by working with governments to either disclose contracts themselves or to build country-specific versions of the open land contracts website, so that they can use the architecture that we've built to then fulfill their transparency commitments. Secondly, we want to equip different rights holders and stakeholders with the tools and resources necessary to effectively read and understand what land contracts say. So as I've mentioned, the annotations of the contracts are there to help users understand what they say. And we also have guides on how to read land contracts on the website and a short tutorial video about how to use the website. Number 3, we hope to catalyze broader awareness of the implications of land contracts and their underlying deals. They might sound like an obscure kind of legalistic detail of land investments, but they can have a lot of impact in practice. And making contracts available and easier to understand is the first step in this process. And then 4th, we want to demonstrate that land contract disclosure is both feasible and valuable. For the reasons that I've mentioned, we can see the value in actually starting to have greater access and understanding about these contracts. And then in terms of feasibility, I always like to bring attention to this blog, which talks about contract disclosure from the extractive industries rather than agriculture and forestry. But I really like that headline just to make clear that in the extractive industries, there's been even more contract disclosure than for land contracts, and the sky hasn't fallen. Host governments are still able to attract investors, and investors' projects haven't been undermined simply by the disclosure of these contracts. Okay, quickly moving on to some of the challenges. First of all, it is still a challenge to convince governments to disclose all of their land contracts. We make a point of not actually leaking contracts on our site. Rather, we work with governments to facilitate disclosure. And
Okay.
part of doing this is to link in
Quando?
with government commitments
Às
under
10h30?
the Open Government Partnership.
Mas é
Um,
agora.
Secondly,
E como é que estou a fazer?
we do face challenges around dissemination to one of our key audiences, which is affected communities and the civil society organisations that support them. Part of this is to do with a lack of internet connectivity for many rural affected communities around the world. And the site, in trying to meet this challenge, the site does have the ability to batch down contracts and annotations so that that information can then be transported to communities that might not have regular internet access. We also like to make clear that just because we are hosting these contracts doesn't mean that we're actually endorsing them as examples of best practice. And the way we do this is to frame the content on the site to make clear that users need to consider the overall context of the deal, and that we are listing these contracts as a transparency effort rather than to say that these are contracts that should just be copied or viewed as best practice. And then there's also some challenges around reliability or credibility of the information that we receive. We have a contract disclosure policy that talks about when contracts will have sufficient indicators of reliability for it to be posted on the site. And then again, we frame the contract on our website to be the publicly available version, but that might not necessarily be the current version that's actually regulating the project. Unfortunately, one of the challenges of transparency is that we're always working with the information at hand. On to practical uses. In 2016, we started a mini-grants program for innovative uses of open land contracts. 2 grants were awarded. The first went to the Centre pour l'Environnement et le Développement, CED, in Cameroon, which is a civil society organisation which is using open land contracts to test guidance on understanding and monitoring of land contracts in general. And they will be focusing on the SGSOC palm oil concession, which is featured on open land contracts. We also had a journalist from Thomson Reuters Foundation who visited land concessions in Cambodia, which he identified on openlandcontracts.org, and then shed light on the need for greater transparency and the benefits of transparency can bring. And you'll see a kind of raft of different headlines at the top of this page, which are some of the articles that he produced talking about different land and investment issues. We also have a contracts exercise on our site that can be incorporated into any training or capacity building efforts that organisations might have around raising awareness of investment contracts. And if anybody here has any other ideas, we'd love to continue the conversation to think about other practical uses for the site. So moving on to my final slide, and perhaps one of the most interesting or important ones for our audience today, how can communities and their civil society allies actually use open land contracts in practice? We view open land contracts as a tool that can be the basis for empowerment around learning more and understanding land contracts. It's designed for users that don't have legal training or experience, and with the view to allowing them to quickly find relevant contracts and have a greater understanding. It can help advocates and community members to understand the contracts that govern these projects and see what other governments in other countries are negotiating, which might inform their opinions of particular deals. It can also assist communities carrying out community-led monitoring efforts. If the information about a particular contract is available, even if the community isn't a party to it, they can still monitor compliance with that and use that as a point of notifying the government if there are breaches or building that into their advocacy campaigns. And then contracts are also another source of enforceable obligations for government and for companies. And communities can use them as a platform for advocacy on legal reform, to advocate for better contracting practices, to hold these actors to account, and especially if the government's failing to monitor and enforce them and so on. So we do see a wide range of uses and for open land contracts, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions and continuing this discussion after the rest of the presentations. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to Julia.
Thank you very much, Sam. And next we will hear from Jessica.
Good morning, everyone, or everyone at least who's in our time zone. Good afternoon and good evening to those who are in other zones. My name is Jessica Webb, and I'm the Civil Society Engagement Manager for Global Forest Watch at the World Resources Institute. And today I'm going to present a little bit about Global Forest Watch and what it does, but more specifically, a recent study that the authors listed on this slide have done, published by WRI, that looks at specifically concession data transparency for logging, mining, and agricultural concessions in 14 different forested countries. Okay, so why forests, first of all? Well, as many of us on this webinar likely know, 1.6 billion people in the world depend on forests. They depend on forests for food security, shelter, and livelihoods. And for these reasons, they're especially important to rural communities, including some of the world's poorest people who rely on forests every day for their subsistence. However, despite their importance, we are losing forests still at the rate of 50 soccer fields worth every minute of every day. Agriculture is still the most significant driver of global deforestation. And with the challenge ahead of us to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050, there's an urgent need to sustainably manage both forested areas and the growth of agricultural lands. In the past, when we needed information to understand how forests were changing, we were forced to rely on reports like these and other static sources of information. It takes a while to create and publish reports like these, so often by the time that they are publicly available, the information is often years out of date and not comparable across different geographies. So Global Forest Watch, which is an online forest information management and monitoring tool, was created to fill the need for timely and actionable information to bridge the gap between data and decision making. Advances in satellite imagery and data, coupled with the ability of high-speed cloud computing, makes it possible for us to visualize deforestation now at a 30 by 30 meter resolution, which is visualized here in the pink pixels. This is something that was not imaginable without this technology even 10 years ago. However, the satellite data alone is not enough. We also need contextual data that will show the who, what, where, and when of the commercial activities that drive over 60% of global deforestation. This is critical to preventing forest loss and also protecting community land rights. So in the image shown here, the yellow shapes or polygons are logging concessions in Sarawak. So it's possible for users anywhere in the world to be able to log on and access this tool, which is open and freely available. And you can see with the contextual data, it shows where tree cover loss, depicted again by the pink pixels, is likely happening both within the logging concessions, but perhaps outside the boundaries of logging concessions where it may or may not be permitted. So used in combination with satellite data, concessions data plays an essential role in allowing us to monitor compliance with and the enforcement of concessions agreements, combating corruption, distinguishing between legal and illegal deforestation, and also making informed land use planning decisions, and reducing conflicts from potential overlapping land claims. To provide one example of how concessions data has been used and why transparency is important. The forest fires and resulting haze, which happens nearly every year during Indonesia's fire season, the fires are caused by illegal slash and burn land clearance, which is often the quickest and least expensive way to open up land for palm oil plantations. Though these activities are illegal, the the fires are rampant every year, creating devastating health and environmental impacts. And the 2015 fire season, which was particularly bad, also cost the Indonesian government more than $16 billion. So proactively disclosing high-quality spatial concessions data not only improves government transparency, but it also increases citizens' capacity to participate in land use decision-making and to act as watchdogs. On Global Forest Watch, users can overlay concessions data, shown here in the yellow shape, with satellite imagery, shown below, and fire alerts, depicted by the red points, to see where burning is occurring and who is responsible for managing that land area. Fires and related health issues have an outsized impact on pregnant women, children, and the elderly. An Indonesian NGO and partner of Global Forest Watch called Women Research Institute used GFW to empower women in civil society organizations to conduct evidence-based advocacy and promote greater transparency in forest concessions and advocate for improved health benefits. However, to date, no previous studies have assessed the availability and accessibility of spatial information, contracts, and tabular data related to concessions across country or sectors. So a new WRI study provides the state of play and land concession transparency with a special emphasis on spatial data. The study looks at agriculture, mining, and logging concessions in 14 forested countries, shown here, which collectively make up over half of the world's forests. And just to be sure that everyone's on the same page, a concession is defined as a area of land which falls under agreement between typically a company and a government. So for state-owned or land held in trust by governments, to companies for a set amount of time for certain commercial or exploitative activities. Researchers in each of the 14 countries looked at data accessibility, including the type of access, so whether it was proactively available, reactively available as through an information request, or through ad hoc or informal requests, what the point of access was, so was it available through an online portal, through an email request, through visiting an office, any barriers to access, such as cost, and whether or not the data was openly licensed, so free to use, reuse, and redistribute. They also evaluated the quality of the data, so looking at the timeliness, completeness, accuracy, and consistency of the data. So just a few highlights from our key findings. This table depicts the means through which the data was accessed by our researchers in each of the 14 countries. We found that Canada, Brazil, Liberia, and Peru disclosed data proactively for all the sectors that were active in their country. And we also found that civil society is still an important source of data in the absence of officially disclosed information, as we can see in the case with Cambodia. However, overall, we found that open, accurate, and comprehensive data is still lacking. So, for example, even though Liberia disclosed data in all of the sectors where it was active, it's disclosed through an online portal and through which the data is not openly licensed nor available to download. It's only viewable online. So there are still some improvements that could be made even where data is proactively available. We did find that countries that have freedom of information laws are generally more transparent than those that aren't. Researchers had fairly good success, actually, in accessing data by making formal information requests through FOI laws. But we also found that countries with FOI laws tended to disclose more data proactively than countries without those laws. We found some inconsistent relationships between membership in transparency-related initiatives and disclosure. So Sam mentioned the EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So we looked at proactive disclosure and membership in EITI as one example of a voluntary partnership. And even though EITI recommends the disclosure of concessions data, we found that in some countries, such as Indonesia, countries were not following these guidelines. We also looked at statistics across different sectors and found, also consistent with something that Sam mentioned, that mining by far was the most transparent sector. So not only was information proactively disclosed, but also information was more accessible, more complete, and better regulated than other sectors. Agriculture, which is a much larger driver of deforestation than mining, was the least transparent of the sectors. So just a few recommendations from our study to conclude. Government should provide greater access to concession data, and ideally proactively in open formats. Donors should invest in building capacity for governments to be able to collate, digitize, and share concessions information proactively in a comprehensive format. Civil society should continue to both advocate for access and disclose data in the absence of official government data, as well as exercise their rights through Freedom of Information Act requests. Relevant agriculture initiatives may have a lot to learn from similar mining initiatives in terms of how to increase transparency. Public disclosure of spatial concessions information and data should be required under voluntary partnership agreements. And we propose considering the development of a global standard on concessions data release, or at least integrating policies into existing standards to improve transparency. If you're interested in reading more, the full study can be downloaded at wri.org/publication, and I look forward to it.
Thank you, Jessica. And before jumping to Elise, I think we have Fritz on the line, who will be able to say a few words. Please, Fritz.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Am I called to speak now?
Yes, Fritz, you can speak now.
Yeah. Okay, let's try. Sorry, everybody. I hope you can hear me fine now. There were some technical problems. Introductions were made, and I don't want to come back to the basics, but just to briefly stress the importance we as the German development policy, but also other donors in the Global Donor Working Group on land, the importance of transparency for good land governance. Land governance has become a priority for German development policy under our initiative One World No Hunger. And we are implementing new programs for securing land rights, reducing land conflicts, and also advancing transparency, including, for example, a cooperation with Transparency International on land and corruption in Africa and the land matrix. And together with other countries and organizations of this Global Donor Working Group on land, we have advocated also for strong standard setting and ambition in international processes, including, for example, the support for a land indicator in the SDGs. But also, for example, right now, during our G20 presidency, we are proposing an initiative for rural youth employment, which is still being negotiated, but which we hope to have finalized actually by the end of this week. There is a meeting in Berlin on Friday, and which also includes rather strong language on the importance of transparency in the context of land governance and land investments. And actually coming back to already Sam's presentation, also a language to support the provision of information by national and international public and private investors. So let's see where we end with that initiative, but this could possibly also be helpful for the initiatives we talked about today. So the two initiatives have been already presented. They are highly appreciated by us and other donors of the group. And to another initiative. So the land matrix has been already introduced by Julia in her preliminary remarks. And I mean, from the information she also mentioned, you can just see that, I mean, with the documented land investment deals of nearly 50 million hectare, out of which 80% in land and forestry, the magnitude of the challenge, because this does not even include domestic investments, which are expected to be even of higher magnitude. So enormous challenges we face in the context of competing land use interests, but also in face of climate change, land degradation, environmental damages, and not least also a growing world population. So some questions we ask ourselves as donors, at least for the German government, is how to secure global food security, which role for smallholder and peasant farmers, and which role for commercial agriculture, how to address the growing conflict potential around land ownership and land use due to insufficient documentation, transparency, and grievance mechanisms, and how to make sure the most vulnerable groups are not left behind. So I think with the presentations we heard already, we are right in the middle of the discussion already. Just let me finish with a quote of one of the proposed key messages of the international conference, Future of the Rural World, that is organized by BMZ starting tomorrow in Berlin, and which includes this G20 segment I talked about, and it will be discussed in a forum on good governance. So the quote would be, rural policies have to be rights-based, conflict-sensitive, and transparent. So with that, I close, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fritz. And now we will move to Elise.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for this exciting webinar. Thanks for inviting me to speak. So I'm Alice from ICV. Just to give you a bit of context, ICV is a social and environmental organization based in Mato Grosso in the Amazon region. We have 10 years of experience working on transparency issues in Brazil. We have applied governance indicators to measure transparency, and we are working with different type of actors from federal to state prosecutors, with state authorities, also with federal authorities, to strengthen information availability. So I think you're going to have a perspective from practitioners here. In Brazil, the level of transparency remain quite low, but the understanding of the role of transparency to curb deforestation and as a tool to really make a difference regarding the rate of deforestation has increased in the last couple of years. So for instance, in 2007, when we began to work on transparency, we were only working in Mato Grosso and only in forest management activity, the transparency of forest management activity. And 10 years after, we have been asked during this 10-year period to work in the whole Amazon on a very different range of activities and involving a lot of different actors on this question of making transparent and actionable information available. So in the work we have done for the WRI working paper on mining and forest concession, I think we've confirmed some basic information regarding transparency in Brazil. We've confirmed that the legal framework in Brazil is quite complete. There is another framework on access to information that set the right to information, and there is also a lot of details on which documents should be available for regarding to concessions. So this helps tremendously to monitor and to implement transparency, to have transparency practices. And that's why when you look at practices regarding mining and forest concession, practices are quite good. There is actually access to a whole bunch of document, inventory, very critical documents to monitor and to have social control on these pieces of land. And so the question is, besides the legal framework, what helped to implement those good practices regarding transparency? I think, unfortunately, forest concession and mining concession are quite an exception in Brazil, because forest concession are quite new, because there is only like the law of forest concession is from 2006, and there is only 10 years of practices. And also, it's not about a lot of land. It's at federal level, there is only 6 concessions actually happening, and at state level, we have concession in the state of Pará and the state of Amapá. So it's easier for forest concession to be transparent. It's not a lot of documents, it's not a lot of information that are being that are made available. So that's why it's also interesting to put it in that present in perspective with a bigger picture. If it's possible, I like to share my screen. Yep. So to put it in perspective with the whole state of transparency in Brazil, I'm sorry it's in Portuguese, but with the illustration, it's maybe easier to understand for English speaker. We have launched a couple of weeks ago transparency indicators in the whole Amazon regarding 6 agendas from environmental regularization, soil, culture, forest management, cattle ranching, and land tenure and idle plants. And when you look at this this map, you can see that land tenure is the worst agenda in terms of making information available. At federal level, it's there is a 62% of availability of actionable information. So that's better than at state level, where, for instance, in Roraima, Amapá, or even Pará or Mato Grosso, there is very few information available on land tenure. And this lack of transparency is mainly due to lack of clarity, but also lack of consensus that this information should be available. Because for state authorities, when you put transparently, when you make this information available, you also indicate for a possible illegal activity that those lands are not being used. So this is something that also needs to be worked on. And I think the main problem is also capacity of states to make information available. So if at federal level in Brazil you have the possibility to use digital systems that are quite solid and performant, at state level the capacity question is quite more difficult. And another, just to conclude, what we also were able to map on this indicator is that from 2014 to 2016, the land tenure agenda actually, the transparency of the land tenure agenda actually decreased. So it's urgent to have a very strong investment in the state of the Amazon to guarantee that they are able to make the information available. That's it.
Thanks, Elise. And she mentioned, but I'm not sure everyone caught it. Elise and her colleagues at ICB were the researchers in Brazil for our study at WRI, and so we're very grateful. They did a very good job.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you, Jessica and Sam. Between the three presenters, we've outlined some of the both legal and technological tools that are being used to improve the transparency of land deals. We see that there's been good forward momentum and progress over the last few years, but also significant challenges that remain in terms of the capacity of states and other actors to share information, incentives for all parties towards transparency, laws on the books, as well as availability of good, timely data. So with that, I will turn to a few questions from the group. But first, I will use my moderator's privilege to ask one question to all of the participants. As we have seen, achieving transparency is hard. There are vested interests that benefit from opacity and a lack of information. People don't necessarily want to level the playing field. The land transparency field is relatively young compared to other transparency initiatives. So my question is, what can we learn from other transparency initiatives on how to incentivize parties to share information?
I'm happy to go first, or Jessica, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Okay. Yulia, it's a really good question. It's something that we kind of puzzle over quite a bit. I think, to speak kind of abstractly about it, we need to have different techniques to make the information more available. And these techniques are kind of tried and true in many different contexts. So things like FOI requests and litigation can kind of be instances of one-off victories for transparency that show that disclosure can be facilitated and is often required under domestic laws. So I think that's one avenue that civil society actors can pursue. And then we also, advocacy and lobbying can build pressure on governments to disclose contracts or other information more proactively. And so it's our hope that open land contracts kind of opens up the discussion about what these contracts are and shows how disclosure by certain governments does not lead to it's not necessarily a disadvantage for host governments. And then building on that, collaboration, facilitation, and capacity building with host governments themselves to actually encourage transparency is something that we hope that the tool will contribute to. And so through all of these different means, you start to have kind of greater pressure and different avenues for increasing transparency and increasing the amount of information that is out there. And then the next step is to have the architecture to actually sort through that information and make it easy to access, but also easy to understand. And I've already kind of spoken about how Open Land Contracts tries to do that, tries to make it a bit more organized with metadata and a bit more understandable through the guides that we have and the plain language annotations.
Great. And just to build on that, and yes, thanks, Julia, for the question. I think it's a great one. Yeah, and I think what we've seen in terms of land contracts and concessions, meaning logging and agriculture specifically, and with mining tending to be more transparent, is that it is possible because there's a difference across sectors, but within the same country, that agriculture and logging or timber concessions could learn a lot from the mining industry. And I think the mining industry has seen that transparency can be a benefit as well in attracting foreign direct investment. Investors want to know that there are minimal or risk of encountering conflicts if they're going to invest in a particular land area, to know who owns or has title to the land. So actually it can be beneficial in that sense. I also agree with comments made by Sam and Elise that often it's a lack of capacity, not necessarily a lack of will for transparency. And WRI has been working in the Congo Basin for over 10 years, closely with governments to create jointly managed forest information management systems, because a lot of it is just a matter of being able to gather and share the data and have that capacity built. So we would definitely recommend that there's more investment by donors and others in this area to help to build that capacity and organize information. A challenge with land concessions information, specifically logging and agriculture, is that often they're dispersed over many different government agencies or ministries. Sometimes they're in ministries of the environment, sometimes it's agriculture. So sometimes it's difficult for governments to be able to share information across those ministries. And then, as Elise mentioned as well, there's particularly in governments that are decentralized or larger countries, oftentimes some of the regulation happens at the local level while other happens at the federal level, and information is stored in different places. So a lot of it is, it's a challenge to get all that information together in one place. And then I would say finally, there are a number of, I think, very proactive initiatives happening at the international level, and one of them is the Open Government Partnership, which is a co-organizer of this webinar. And through the OGP, WRI, along with the Natural Resources Governance Institute, co-chairs a working group on natural resources and the environment. So helping countries both create commitments through the Open Government Partnership to be able to make information about land investments more transparent, and then also assistance with implementation of those commitments. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to follow up with us.
Great, thank you, Sam and Jessica. So we'll take a question from one of the participants, and this question relates to technology. So as we've seen over the last several years, advances in technology, anything from the availability of higher resolution imagery to the availability of, for example, less expensive drones that can fly over forested areas and be able to see what is happening. This availability of new technology is advancing transparency initiatives. The question is, going forward, which technological advances do you see as the most promising for further advancing the transparency of land investment contracts?
It's a good question. I can take that to start. So obviously technology is very central to Global Forest Watch's work, and we very much see the platform as a type of leapfrog technology, in that I didn't go into detail about the functionality and capabilities of the platform, but it's possible for users to go online in the portal and either draw a shape around the areas that they're interested in, or they can select a pre-existing shape, such as a protected area, or even upload shape files that they may have to be able to do on-the-fly analysis, being able to see how much tree cover loss has occurred in a specific area for a specific amount of time. And this means that users now no longer need to have GIS experience to be able to do this type of analysis. So we're constantly looking for ways to innovate and make finding the answers to the questions that users are interested in easier and easier to access. Something else that we're very excited about is mobile technology, which is another great example of a leapfrog technology. So now people currently living in rural areas or remote areas, which are typically forested areas, don't have access to landlines, but now, increasingly more and more people have access to cell phone. So we're developing a mobile app called Forest Watcher that will allow users to, when they have internet access, download the deforestation alert data or fires alert data and take that offline into the field to go out and investigate the alerts and see what's actually happening on the ground, and then fill out a form and take pictures or videos to collect evidence about that. They can also, if they have a drone, send the drone out to go see what's really happening on the ground, which provides a more complete picture, a complement at the local level to what we're seeing at the global level.
Thanks, Jessica.
And I'll just add really quickly. I think especially when we're looking at investment contracts, because we're looking at kind of legal documents and regulatory documents, in some ways for us it's less about looking at the kind of future innovations in technology, and more about thinking about how can existing technical capacities in either the global north or in capital cities around the world, how can they kind of extend further to reach people in remote areas who might lack connectivity as well? Because I think that's going to allow kind of greater information access, which allows more users to kind of engage with open land contracts and other relevant online tools that can kind of give them more information about how land contracts are being regulated in any particular case. And that brings me to the next point, which is that another thing that we try to do with open land contracts is build interlinkages with other online initiatives so that users aren't only presented with the contract, which is a kind of static document that often bears little resemblance to what might be happening on the ground, with other initiatives that provide additional context. So there was a question in the chat room of this webinar about what sorts of information do our systems provide about investor companies and whether they are multinational firms or state-owned entities. And open land contracts interlinks with Open Corporates, a website that has a lot of information about different investor companies. So for each contract, you can usually, if there's an entry on Open Corporates, you can click through to that to learn more about the company. And then we also have interlinkages with the Land Matrix, which has been mentioned several times in this webinar, which provides a lot more kind of contextual and political information about how did the deal come to be, and also what's the current status of the deal and how is it unrolling in practice. So we definitely don't want to silo the tool by itself. We want to use technology and other really interesting efforts and tools and trying to create as many linkages as possible so that users can, by accessing one tool, can have access to a kind of really rich base of information about any particular deal.
Great, thank you, Sam. We are right at 10 o'clock, but if the participants will indulge us, we'll continue for just a few more minutes and ask one or two more questions. The next question is to both Sam and Jessica. And the question is, are you able to gather information on on the sources of these specific contracts and concessions? So are they multinational investment companies? Are they nation states? Are they domestic investments? And then I'll tack on a second part to that question. What is that information telling you? What are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Sam, do you want to go
Sure.
first?
Yeah, so we do have metadata categories for each contract. The researcher who processes and uploads the contract has quite a detailed list of metadata categories, and that includes things like not only the company name, but like I was saying before, linkages to Open Corporates so that people can find out more information, and also things like the company's address and potentially where the company is registered and so on. So there is additional information there, and that information, we have an open source API, so if there are researchers out there, that information can be freely accessed and processing can be done to figure out trends. I would just say I haven't done that kind of quantitative analysis to see whether, what sorts of investors figure predominantly, but anecdotally, and just kind of my impression from being so closely involved with the site, is that we see a real mixture, and often we see a third category, which is international firms that are then required by domestic law to create a a company that's domiciled in the host country as well. So there are definitely examples of even individuals, but also local companies. There's a lot of individual investors that seem to be active in Ethiopia, for instance, that we have contracts regarding. But then we have kind of higher profile international firms like Firestone, which makes an American company that makes tires, as well as that third category that I mentioned of companies that might have parent companies that are based all around the world, but then have that kind of host state domiciled corporate entity that is the formal signatory to the company.
Yeah. And in terms of Global Forest Watch, yes, for all of the data that's included on this site, we have source data and metadata. So we have sort of two categories of publicly available data. One is the more official Global Forest Watch data, which comes from official sources. So either directly from governments, either data that we've acquired from them directly and have received permission to post on the site, data that's publicly available, or in some cases it's data that has been collated at a national or regional level by a civil society organization that originally comes from government sources. So we also allow users to publish and post their own data. So we see the platform very much as a neutral space for dialogue. We recognize that sometimes there will be, particularly with the spatial data, differences in terms of the exact boundaries of speaking of concessions again here, like what the specific concessions boundaries are. So we see the platform very much as a tool for all, for governments, private sector, and civil society to bring information together in one space and work together to create the most accurate and up-to-date information possible in that sense. In terms of looking at ownership of concession information, this was something that we looked at in the study, more in understanding which countries, on the metric for completeness, understanding which countries included which data, including ownership information. And we asked about beneficial ownership information as well, but we definitely found that the countries that tended to be overall more transparent also had more complete attribute data associated with the information, but we didn't take it as far as doing an actual analysis of the types of owners that were in that. But for anyone who's interested, again, we're happy to talk more about the details of our findings.
Great, thank you both. Last question for today, but before asking it, just to mention that there are several more questions and we've recorded them in the chat, so I would encourage the participants to just respond via email to the individuals who asked the questions. So the last question for today is, the question is specific to, the instance is specific to Mozambique, but I think it can be extrapolated more globally. The question is that in Mozambique, the main issue is related to the process of reaching an agreement, so that the process of actually entering into the agreement is not very participatory, and there's not very much information that's shared on both sides, the communities and the investors. So are there tools to empower rural communities and others to engage with investors in understanding the key basic aspects to consider before reaching an agreement?
Yeah, I'm happy to start if that suits. So it's a really good question, and the first thing that I need to do is just distinguish. I think that Jose's question here is primarily looking at investor community negotiations and interactions, because often we can have contracts or agreements between companies and host communities rather than the government. So open land contracts is primarily focused on investor state contracts, but we do feature some of these community investor contracts when they relate to a deal and where we have the investor state contract as well. And so I would say that open land contracts isn't kind of the primary tool to think about these things, but we're definitely aware of them. And then we do have other efforts and work products at CCSI that look at this exact question. So right now we are collaborating with the legal empowerment NGO Namati on a guide for communities and their advisors on how to negotiate with investors who are seeking to carry out land-based investments. And that will look at the question for communities as to whether or not negotiating is actually a good idea in any particular case, and then to go through some of the content that can be included in a community investor agreement. So it could just be a straight lease, but you could also have agreements that are focused on benefit sharing and on creating other enforceable rights that communities can use to hold investors to account at a later stage. And then we've also thinking about community participation more generally and in the investor state context, we've also started to look at that question and look at how to build in meaningful consultation and participation and even free, prior and informed consent into the investor state contract negotiation stage of the investment. So we presented a paper on this very topic at the World Bank Land and Poverty Conference earlier this year, and that can be found on the World Bank's conference website. And I'm also happy to share that paper with anybody who might be interested. It's still a draft paper, but it's definitely a question that needs to be considered, because it's all well and good to acknowledge that communities are usually excluded from the negotiation of investor state contracts. But the next step is to actually start to articulate different modes in which communities can be involved. Should they be regularly consulted while these contracts are being negotiated? Should they even be in the room as an observer, or even taking it a step further, do we want to start to see more tripartite investment contracts where communities are actually another party to the investment contract and therefore have greater ability to hold both the government and the investor to account if things start to go wrong?
Yeah, just to add, getting into the actual agreement process is outside of Global Forest Watch's wheelhouse, but our main focus is being able to provide the most up-to-date and accurate information possible so that whoever the parties are who are entering into the agreements can see what is happening, particularly in regards to the potential impacts of deforestation, and then who's responsible, what the boundaries are of the agreement. However, I will mention that we've seen some of our partners use, we have a template called Map Builder, which allows users to create their own kind of mini Global Forest Watch, so pull in some of the data that we have on their site and add other data that they have. And one of our partners in Colombia, Ambiente Sociedad, created a platform which is an early warning system for mega infrastructure projects in Colombia that and more in the upstream in the process. So as the projects are beginning, the information is put on the site so that communities are aware of them earlier on and have an opportunity to participate in the process before it even reaches the agreement negotiation phase. So yes, we have seen lots of great initiatives out there in that regard.
Great, thank you both. Well, with that, I would like to close the webinar. Thank you to our presenters, Sam, Jessica, Elise, and Fritz. Thank you very much to the World Bank for hosting us, and thank you to everyone in the audience who tuned in.
Yes, and thank you, Yulia.
Thank you, Yulia. Thank you, Sam.